Welcome to the 139th edition of Europe Calling. Today, together in cooperation with Michael Bloss, who is at the climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. My name is Maximilian Fries. I'm the executive director of Europe Calling, and I'm especially welcoming our guests here, whom you can already see here, and whom we will be introducing in more detail later on. On the slide that I'll be showing now, you can see how the evening will be structured. We will first hear from our special guest, Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, and then there will also be a question and answer session. And in the second part, we'll have a panel discussion with our four guests. As is usual, for Europe Calling, you can ask your questions and vote on the questions of others, and we'll pick up those questions. You can see the link here and a QR code. We're using Slido for that. There are two rooms there tonight, one for the keynote by Annalena Baerbock and one for the panel discussion. Please put your questions there and vote on the questions of others. I'll put the link to that also here in the chat. And there we have Annalena Baerbock. Welcome, good evening. And actually that's great because I'm already done with my technical introduction. I'll just mention that Europe Calling is being recorded as usual, so please take that into account when you ask questions using your name. And I'll just hand over to Michael Bloss and Annalena Baerbock to Sharm el-Sheikh and the climate conference. Micha, it's great that we're doing this together, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the two of you. Oh, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. We're sitting here in front of a poster, and we're on the climate conference, and I'm glad that we can have an exchange here, because as usual, only when the climate conference ends does it really get started. I would now, to begin with, unfortunately, the speaker cannot be understood. Annalena, we're unfortunately, our sound is currently bad. Micha, maybe we heard you better than the minister. Is that possible? Maybe we have to talk slightly more slowly. Will it work then? Is it working now? Because until you came, it was working perfectly. Could you maybe say something again? Yes, I think this is about the devices. Maybe, Micha, could you give her your earpods, because it seems to be the devices. Try again. Yes, I'll test again. Yes, I can now be heard more loudly. That's okay. It seems that one of the two is broken. So I'll start over. Good evening to everyone. It's great to be here with you from the climate conference, which officially would be ending tomorrow, but actually it's only getting started now properly, because at the end we always have the negotiations about the controversial subjects. And I think what's new about this climate conference, and that we are focused on here as the German government, one such topic is loss and damage, where so far the attitude of all industrial countries didn't want to speak about this subject. We said we can't continue like that. This is the climate crisis is the biggest crisis of many countries, and we cannot say that we don't talk with these countries about what will happen to those that are so much faced with so many controversies, but consequences, who have no financial means of dealing with that. So we brought this subject up at the COP conference, and as it often is, a big subject has been opened up, and some who had hidden behind it before, who said, because others weren't talking about it, we can also not talk about it. We are now in a situation that's slightly at an impasse where we're saying that if we cannot sort out the entire financial mechanism for it, then we don't even have to talk about loss and damage. And I, also from European side, I'm personally very much arguing for building a financial architecture, now that we've brought this subject up, that will be viable for the future, and which also means that more countries pay in, also countries like China, because their emissions will, of course, also have consequences for future damages. For the past, of course, the industrial countries are responsible. And so for us, it was important that we readjusted Germany's position regarding the 100 billion. We're not at the point where we want to be. We have a loss of trust on that issue, which cannot simply be repaired with a simple proposal on loss and damage. But nevertheless, I think we have a unique opportunity now to get talking on subjects other than loss and damage also when we sort out the financing. So how to make sure that countries don't even embark on the path of coal. Another key issue where the target is already clear, we only need the implementation, where in the years after the climate agreement of Paris, our path is 1.5, not 2 or 1.8. And now we finally have to say how we can get there in the not sometime 2032, 37, 42, but rather what we will do in this coming decade, in the 20s. And so we, as a European delegation, are very much promoting the idea that we want to have an ambitious working program for mitigation, where we would do much as we did in Germany with the Climate Protection Act. We would have sector-specific targets so that there are no longer any pretexts for not acting. And this is, of course, being negotiated over in a contentious manner, because many other large emitters that have so far not been a part of this are worried that they will have to tighten their national goals as well and targets. So we don't know what will actually be the result. We will be fighting for until the last minute that we really have clear commitments on reduction, that we will be having the emissions by 32, and that on loss and damage, we will be creating an instrument where it's not those most affected that are paying, the island nations, but others. And then we have to see where we stand. And finally, I want to say, because this sometimes gets lost, that I think that this conference, despite the terrible situation in the world, the war, the food crisis, all the extreme weather events, we mustn't diminish these large challenges. But also this conference, if we didn't have this conference, then we would live in a different world. We know what a difference Friday for Future has made also in Germany, and human rights are also a part of climate policy, and we cannot do without this conference. We would be on a 4-degree path if we didn't have it. I want to make sure that that's also clear. Even if the conference doesn't result in what the world actually needs, still that is not a complete failure, but rather we also need to find additional paths of getting ahead. And so even if 192 countries couldn't agree on the most ambitious path forward, that doesn't mean we should say we won't do anything, but rather we do as much as we can multilaterally and in a European way, and with our climate partnership. And we have a great project now that we agreed on with Kenya, how we can support them until 2030 to switch their entire energy sector to renewables. And those are small successes during such a COP conference, which from my point of view also make a big difference in Africa, because the countries there can not only say, look, you can see how in Germany that it can work, but also people can say, look, in Kenya they're doing it, maybe others can join them. Okay, thank you very much. If you still have a couple of time for a couple of questions.
Wie stehen Sie zur Forderung der Initiative Debt for Climate, den Ländern des globalen Südens alle Schulden zu erlassen, sodass sich diese leisten können, fossile Energieträger am Boden zu lassen und eine gerechte Energiewende zu finanzieren? Gibt es dazu überhaupt Debatten auf der COP?
Also Debatten gibt es viele, und Barbados hat ja da so einen Vorschlag eingebracht, auch auf höchster Staatspräsidentenebene deutlich gemacht, wir müssen über die globale Finanzarchitektur reden. Das sehe ich ganz und gar genauso. Wir hatten deswegen auf dem G7-Außenministerinnen-Treffen, da sieht man auch, wie sich Politik in dem Sinne verändert hat, dass man deutlich macht, alles hängt mit allem zusammen, dass bei dem Außenministerinnen-Treffen zum ersten Mal der IWF vertreten war, weil wir mit denen darüber gesprochen haben, wie wir eigentlich die globalen Finanzströme in Klimaneutralität umlenken können. Und die Schuldenfrage zum Beispiel war da auch eine der zentralen Fragen, die wir mit diskutiert haben. Auf die konkrete Frage von Tino, den Nachnamen habe ich leider nicht so schnell notieren können, ob wir einfach so alle Schulden von allen Staaten erlassen, würde ich sagen, nein. Aber das ist kein Nein.
We were looking at whether there could be a debt relief for all countries, and that was a clear no. And of course, we cannot be naive, and we need to take a very close look at the situation and see how countries accumulated those debt, corruption or other reasons. Of course, there are dictatorships who accumulated debt on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there are states who were affected by climate impact, and they said, and I met a lot of colleagues here, and they said, well, we can't invest in education because we need to finance climate impact mitigations. And to speak to such countries.
Jetzt haben wir Annalena Baerbock verloren.
So it seems like we've lost Ms. Baerbock and Michael, and I just hope it won't be for long. I really do hope they'll be right back.
So, warten wir mal kurz.
Jetzt?
Seid ihr wieder da? Ja, super, ihr seid wieder da.
Now, is this working? Yes, excellent.
Sehr gut, danke.
Seems like we're back. So, thank you. One more question to you. This is a question by Emily Duturn, and she would like to know this. Dear Annalena Baerbock, as an important actor, global actor with regard to climate policy, we're glad to welcome Brazil back on stage. So what are the goals when it comes to cooperating with the Lula government until January 23? Now, this is the third time I'm going to try this. I hope it'll work. So looking at loss and damage, there is one idea looking at relocating villages. So we can't just relocate them. We also have the responsibility. So we want to make clear that when we relocate villages, that will cover energy supply with green energy and not install generators and fossil fuels. And here we need to invest, and while we do these investments, one thing needs to be clear: that needs to be green investment in green energy. Excellent, thank you so much. So this worked. Allow me also to ask another question. Emily Duturn is delighted to have Brazil back on the international stage, especially with regard to climate policy. So her question is, what about climate targets with regard to cooperating with the Lula government as of January 23? I'm not sure I can answer this question at this point because the president is not the incumbent president just yet. I'll be able to say more once he's taken office. So now saying, well, we'll just go somewhere to a country and have our development cooperation projects, and not sure if you like it or not, or if it works in this village or another. I think that's an approach that doesn't fit our current time. So all energy partnerships that we set up now, like with Kenya or Indonesia, where questions might come up, people come in and say, if we want to set up a climate partnership, we need to leave coal behind. Of course, we cannot force you, but we can say, well, we cannot implement certain projects if this doesn't go hand in hand with the Paris Agreement. And I've seen, and this also goes for Brazil, protecting the rainforest is essential to achieving the 1.5 climate target. So we cannot use certain resources then, but we need to make alternatives available. There are funds, there are investment measures. And if Brazil says, well, we won't use these measures, then we'll offer alternatives to you. And I think that is a good approach. And there's also trade policy, especially in times like these, where we say, well, do not trade with Russia or take a close look at trade with China. So countries might approach us with, and are more interested now in trading with us, and approach us with trade agreements like Mercosur. And I remember that well because I was chair of the Green Party at the time, and I said, well, we cannot do that. Paris Agreement isn't included, so human rights standards and such isn't part of it. But now we have different projects and different approaches and install a climate partnership as well. And I think they would be quite interested. Looking at technology transfer, I think it would also make sense for us to be part of the economic development, and it might make sense to look at neighboring countries as well, because they weren't included at the time because we couldn't cooperate in the way that we had intended to. So there is a lot in the pipeline, I think. And when it comes to Brazil, its main priority, climate protection is a main priority to them. But also speaking about values, how can we have cooperation based on values? I think that can be processed, also looking at what has happened in the past. So I think we have many areas where we could potentially and should increase cooperation, in my opinion. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Maybe you would also like to pose a question. I'm not sure how much time you have, Minister. Well, I'm not sure. I'm just checking, but I think I can take one last question. Excellent. So allow me to ask maybe this question, because it seems like it's something a lot of people are concerned about. Can we achieve the 1.5 targets, even if the climate conference ends well? Can we still achieve the 1.5 degree target? But not with this climate conference alone. I think we have to be honest here, and we cannot solve all the problems with this climate crisis. Of course, infrastructure policy, industrial policy plays a role, and those are things that we cannot solve here at the climate conference. But we can make a contribution. And how so? Well, in the consequent years, in the years to come, we need to take major steps ahead and have spin-off innovations. That's what's needed. So new technologies. When a lot of my fellow party members will know it well, there were many discussions, and I was the one who spoke a lot about how can we write down a date and say that's when we'll have achieved the 1.5 target. But life doesn't go this way. There can be good and positive impacts, and when you work on something, you need to cooperate and you need to find ways to accelerate. So if we follow the path as we are right now, then we will massively fail to attain the 1.5 or even the 2-degree target. However, if we join forces now, if we focus, if we hyper-focus on topics like hydrogen, produce green hydrogen, and if countries come together, if they cooperate, if the best technologies persevere, and if we implement them, then I think it can be done. Looking back at the Paris Agreement, at the conference in Paris, we also said, let's use these conferences for the electrification of the African continent. So this will not only cater into the hands of European power supply, but also facilitate a good development on the African continent. And I don't think you should be a politician if you didn't believe to be able to change things for the better. I do believe if we join forces, if we work together, if we cooperate, then we'll be able to achieve the 1.5 target goal. Mr. Rahmstorf is here with us tonight, and I'm sure he can say a lot more on this topic. But allow me to go back to my work, pull up my sleeves to make sure that we'll get to our targets, and we as the EU have our obligations, and we want to achieve them, and not only looking at the energy sector alone, no, also infrastructure, transport, on air, on water, on water, on the road, and all different aspects as well. So allow me to final conclusions. Some final conclusions. We have first projects as well, and Ms. Clark said it as well. Climate diversity or diversity is crucial, and we need to accelerate now and move forward to be able to do it. And Mr. Rahmstorf will tell me now, I told you already 10 years ago. But I'm sure we can still do it. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to everyone from the civil society. Thank you so much for everyone who works on this. Thank you for making sure that this still is a priority despite the war, the year of war. So thank you so much and goodbye.
Okay, that was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Genau, dass das Internet ein bisschen wackelig war.
Again, I'm sorry about the shaky internet. It seems to be a bit difficult at Sharm el-Sheikh. One would hope that it would be better at a big climate conference, but that's how it is. I want to make something transparent before we continue. I did not read all the questions from the Slido, not because I didn't like the others by their content, but because they were anonymous. And I thought that was a bit of a pity that makes the interaction less flowing in that situation. So please put your questions by name, and I will give the question on Senegal into the round, and I'll also ask it to Michael Bloss. And now that I have a name for it, because they got a lot of votes, we can also give it to Annalena later on. It's an important subject. Now for the second part of the event. For that, I am greeting our four guests, Chiara Martinelli. She is the director of the Climate NGO Network, Climate Action Network Europe. Yero Sarr, he is a co-founder of Fridays for Future in Senegal. He also did a lot of other things, but that's a main point of what he did. And Professor Stefan Rahmstorf, climate researcher and head of the Earth System Analysis Department at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. We will now, and of course also Michael Bloss, who is the speaker for climate policy of the Green Party in the European Parliament, and he's also co-hosting this event and will also be giving saying a few words. We will now hear from our four panelists, their statements, and then we will go into the Q&A session. We'll start with Yero Sarr. He will be speaking in French, and you will have translation into German and English. As I said, you can activate it in the control panel. And I think it will be great. Yero, we're looking forward to your contribution. The floor is yours.
D'accord. Bonsoir à tout le monde. Je suis Yero Sarr.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Yero Sarr. My name is Yero Sarr, and I'm from Senegal. It's great, wonderful to be able to be here today, to have the privilege of being here today. I am with Fridays for Future in Senegal, and we have been working together with colleagues from all over the world for a long time. We try to improve the situation for the world population and for ourselves, and we also work together with the government.
C'est l'une des raisons pour laquelle nous nous sommes engagés, c'est l'une des raisons pour laquelle nous nous sommes engagés pour améliorer les conditions de vie de nos populations.
We are active, we try to promote protection measures, and we try to stand up for the population. And we're motivated by what motivates the entire Fridays for Future movement. So what motivates us? Why are we engaged in this movement? In the Senegal, we face big challenges. We suffer from the impact of climate change, and that's the main reason why we become active, why we take action, and we really want to achieve change. Maybe you will allow me also to say the following. We are now in the 21st century, after all, and there we really face quite comprehensive challenges. In particular, with respect to the climate crisis. And this is the main reason for us being at the COP conference. We want to find good solutions. We want to support those who take the decisions in taking good decisions.
Nous sommes tous unanimes aujourd'hui qu'il y a des causes, les causes qui sont liées au changement climatique. Nous sommes tous unanimes aujourd'hui qu'il y a certaines populations qui sont, il y a certains pays qui sont à la base du changement climatique.
It's the climate change. It's also the case that there are populations worldwide that are fueling climate change and others that suffer from it. And I think that's essential. There are parts of the world that fuel climate change, and that's why we get involved. We have to act urgently. Why is it so important for us to get engaged, to be involved? With the German government in the last years, we were able to observe a heightened interest compared to the previous years. Also, if you look at their statements, their public statements.
On a constaté qu'il y a cela quelques mois, le chancelier allemand est venu à Dakar.
Investment is still being made mostly in fossil energies, and there was a visit of a German delegation in Dakar, and this was also about taking new approaches in gas extraction. And if you look at the statements in that regard, then we can note that there is now a turning away from fossil energies. Some contracts with private actors have already been concluded. Maybe you should also know that there are great challenges and risks. Senegal has a large coastal area, and there are many people who whose livelihood is based on fishery. Everything they need is drawn from the ocean, their food, whatever else they need for life. And if they now plan a project on the coast, then this will affect the local population. This should be taken into account. You should reflect on that. You should also know it's very hot where I come from. Maybe you know the numbers on climate, on global warming. You may know how many people have already been forced to leave their home area. There's a large population who can no longer live where it used to live. And there is another large problem, which is secret migration or concealed migration. This also affects the EU, but what do you think how we should live, how we should survive? We have to go on the move. We have to find solutions, possibilities. We have to take our life into our own hands. And what can we do if we can no longer live off fishery, off fishing? That is what moves people's minds. What's on people's minds. So it's quite a collection of miscellaneous problems that we are currently facing in Senegal. And I think you mustn't underestimate that. You shouldn't lose sight of that. And you should talk to people and talk to them on an equal footing and take their concerns seriously, especially when it's about people living on the ocean. It's also partly about justice. And that's what we also want to talk about with the German government. We don't just want aid, just like that. We want to be able to survive. In Africa, there are infinite resources. There are so many resources on our planet. We have huge areas at our disposal. We can produce energy in various ways, but also lay water pipes. There are many chances, opportunities on our continent. Why don't we make use of them? Yes, Germany wants to help Senegal, it supports Senegal. Of course, we gladly accept the aid. I'll say that quite openly and honestly, but on our continent, there are also difficulties. Also in implementing projects, but despite the problems, but nevertheless, a lot can be achieved and these problems can be addressed and solved. It's a partnership and you have also something to gain when Senegal does better. Thank you very much. That was a great insight that we got. I saw some questions in the Slido, but we'll do that later. We'll first continue with the list of speakers, and we'll continue with, I have to look at my schedule now, with Stefan Rahmstorf. Stefan Rahmstorf, as I mentioned, is a climate researcher. You're actually the only one except for me who's not in Sharm el-Sheikh today. So we are looking forward to your assessment of the climate conference and of what may already be known in terms of texts, and also the question, can we even still stay within the 1.5 degree target? Yes, thank you very much for having the pleasure to join you here. I'm speaking from Potsdam near Berlin in Germany from my office, and despite the small technical disturbances from Sharm el-Sheikh, I want to say that it's great that nowadays we can speak to our foreign minister on a different continent live, and she was willing to face questions openly. 10 years ago and even 5 years ago, something like this was hardly thinkable. Now, Annalena Baerbock announced that I would be showing a lot of graphs. I didn't actually plan on doing that, but I do want to show one on this issue of can we still stick to the 1.5 degree target, or rather, if we continue with business as usual, when would we end up at that temperature? So this is the observed temperature. And if we take the linear trend across the last 50 years, this has been almost linear since the 70s, the warming. Then in 2040, we would reach the 1.5 degree limit. If we take the last 20 years for the trend, then it would be 2035. So you could say that the 20-year trend shows some acceleration, but these are two El Nino events that are pulling the curve upwards, and that may be fluctuations. So it could also be going in the other direction again. So which of these trend lines is really definitive, and whether there is actually an acceleration of the warming, I would put a question mark to that. But you can certainly see on the graph that if we manage to deflect the curve here, then we do still have a chance to stop warming at 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC report, the last one from this year, did say that we still have a path to 1.5 degrees, however, only with very deep changes and very rapid changes. And also the International Energy Agency, briefly before the COP conference, published its new energy outlook and said that there is a narrow but feasible way, a path to the 1.5 degree goal. Whether we actually achieve that is a question of policy. It's for the political sphere. It's not physically or technically impossible, but rather if we don't achieve that, then it's because the political will was not strong enough, that the priorities were not set clearly enough to manage this problem and keep it manageable. Another slide, if I can manage to bring it up. The current situation is that we're on a path that we will be ending up at roughly 3 degrees, maybe slightly below or a bit above, with the current policies. This is these are stagnating emissions that are shown here. Until 5 years ago, it even looked as if we were on a path towards still rising emissions. So the emissions haven't shown a trend, a change in trend downwards yet, but at least we have a similar level, a slight notch down because of the corona pandemic. But it seems that we've reached a plateau, and if we put more effort into it, we might be able to get down from it. But the path that we need for reaching the 1.5 degrees, its main feature is that we would have to take a very clear downturn here. The main reason is that the main greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, stays in the atmosphere very long, decades even. So it's the cumulative amount that we emit into the atmosphere since the beginning of the industrialization. And this cumulative emission is the area under this curve. We could paint it in here, but so we have to go down quickly. If we go down slowly, then we have a lot more area under the curve, and that would mean we have spent a lot more of our emission budget. So that's the decisive aspect that is now the key issue. This initial rapid reduction here in the 20s, so that we have a larger emission budget later on to use up for the emissions that are harder to avoid, because the emissions for electricity production are relatively easy. We have the technology for that. I'm talking about renewable energy here, and it's growing exponentially, and the price now is such that it's the most affordable energy that you can build currently. So we are in the middle of a solution of that part of the problem worldwide. The last slide I want to show, if we look at the last commitments from the Glasgow conference and the national determined contributions that were promised there, so the national targets, then the climate tracker says that we're here already in the area of 2.4 degrees. If these officially announced targets were kept, but if we also take the long-term pledges about climate neutrality and so on, then if we include that, then we're already on a path towards 2 degrees, which already shows you that it's possible. And the optimistic scenario, the best case scenario, if everyone sticks to everything they ever promised and announced and what they said they will do, then we are already moving towards 1.8 degrees and below the 2-degree level. So it's not hopeless, but we do have to make a huge effort to accelerate things. I am convinced that phasing out fossil fuels will happen anyway. The climate change is happening, and it would be a pity if we can't manage to do it fast if it's going to happen anyway. And doing it fast would allow us to stick to the targets of Paris, the 1.5 degrees, and not the 2 degrees. We could say that if we can't reach 1.5, then maybe we'll do 1.6. But the scientific results of the last few years have shown clearly how important it is not to go beyond tipping points. The effect that this has, for instance, on biodiversity. So we must stop at 1.5 degrees and not much beyond that. And that's it for me, and I'm looking forward to discussing all this with you. Thank you very much. It happens rarely in this kind of talk that you actually leave with a positive, optimistic feeling. So it's important what you said also at the beginning, the attention on this subject, and we brought thousands of people here into this discussion round with the foreign minister. And I think that also shows how the situation also in civil society has changed and how a lot has changed in climate politics. And that is really quite hopeful. So we continue with Chiara Martinelli. She's the co-director of the Climate Action Network Europe, and we are looking forward very much to your assessment directly from the COP. Chiara is also at Sharm el-Sheikh.
Thank you, and thank you, Stefan. I will start from what you said, like 1.5 is still possible, but as you said, a radical change is needed. So I also want to start on a positive note to also for all the people that are following us from Germany and not from Sharm el-Sheikh. We are many here from civil society all around the world, and that's our main mission here, to try to make sure that, that 1.5 is still alive, as we are shouting often also in the different spaces here of the UNFCCC zone, where we are working every day since the 6th of November. So, I mean, looking at your scheme, Stefan, I thought like maybe what I can share is really our assessment as Climate Action Network Europe, what's at stake in these days and in the next hours, where we hope that countries will find a compromise and will find an agreement on how to move forward. So I have, I would say, 4 messages on what is at stake, according to me, in this moment. So the first one, linking up also what has been said at the beginning, I mean, this is, we all came here with the hope that this should be a COP of implementation. So a COP where things actually are moving forward, where the Paris Agreement is protected, and that where words will bring to action. You probably remember last year when we were in Glasgow, there were a lot of announcements, a lot of promises. So we worked hard the whole year to make sure that here in Sharm el-Sheikh, this COP could be about implementation. But the first days of this COP, and I think I need really to highlight here, have been extremely difficult for all the participants because we did find ourselves in a very complicated situation in terms of logistics, and we had to fight a lot in the first days especially, but we are keeping the pressure high until the end in protecting civil society participation in this space. And why I'm saying that? Because unfortunately, we are hosted by a country where human rights violation is a daily issue. And we were all convinced from day one that this should be something that we need to bring in this table. And it's not a separate issue because we all know that there is no climate justice if human rights are not respected. So I think this needs to be, we need to keep saying this. There is pressure to make to avoid that we mix up things. I heard, negotiators coming to me and saying like, one thing are the texts and one thing is the human rights situation. That's not true. I mean, there is no climate justice without human rights. And as Yero shared his experience and the experience of this country, I mean, I think this is very concrete in front of all our eyes. So there is a high responsibility from all of us to keep our governments accountable on raising that voice. Then my second message is around what we say, we need to make sure that this implementation will keep the three pillars of the Paris Agreement together. And the three pillars are mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So we need to make sure that an implementation COP keep those three pillars together. And if I start with the mitigation and the 1.5, I mean, I'm not going, because over on that, I mean, Stefan already explained it very well. So for me, I think what we are fighting for in these hours is to make sure that the reference to 1.5 remain clear. And I mean, I'm happy to also share with you that European countries are showing leadership on that regard, but also that we move a step forward in a clear political will that is also present in the text, that we need to phase out from all fossil fuels as soon as possible. And I think this is very much important also in the next hours, also looking at all the geopolitical context we are all operating in, that we keep our voice united on that regard. And I wanted to mention on that point a particular campaign that I really encourage you all to Google on. That is a campaign led by civil society from Africa, and the campaign is Don't Gas Africa, and is really a campaign that is aiming to call for European leaders to stop shopping for new infrastructure of new gas in African countries. And I think this is was very much high into the agenda of the last days. Then, if I go, my third message is really on loss and damage finance. I mean, as we heard from Yero, loss and damage and the climate crisis is not an issue of the future, it's an issue and a struggle of the present. So we do have to also make sure that loss and damage also has a financial leg, as we say here. So what we are calling here is for countries to make sure that at the end of this COP, there is a proposal and a commitment to finance and to support financially the most vulnerable countries when it comes to addressing loss and damage. And this, I think, is an important conversation that countries are having in these hours. And what we are calling for, and because we see a little bit missing, is to make sure that the principle of equity and of common but differentiated responsibility is part of this conversation. So it's not all about money, but it's about how this money should be distributed and how this money should be tailored and allocated, starting from the most vulnerable countries. And then my last message, it's about Europe and the role that Europe is playing. I think everybody here, and I personally, I was happy to see Europe coming quite well prepared for this COP, meaning like having achieved quite good results in the European legislations around the European Green Deal. So we do need Europe to still play a global leader role. There is nobody else that can start first. So this is a little bit the bad news, but I think it's giving the European Union a leverage point to really be the one breaking the ice and showing global leadership in this very complicated global geopolitical scenario. And I think this is making, I mean, just to conclude, is important to say, because also we all know that whatever outcomes of this COP will be, the work starts the day after. And I think Europe is in a good position to keep moving and to keep raising the bar on ambition at all levels. I think I stop here.
Vielen Dank und auch vielen Dank auch für diese
Thank you very much, and also thank you for this transition directly to Michael Bloss. That's almost as if it had been coordinated. Michael Bloss is the climate policy speaker of the Green Party in the European Parliament. He is here in Sharm el-Sheikh as a delegation, as part of a delegation of the European Parliament. Michael, we are very much looking forward to hearing how you assess the situation, also what Europe is doing. We heard a lot about, or talked a lot about, individual countries. What is the EU doing in this climate conference? Yes, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. And I'm glad that this is working out, and thank you to all the guests. It's just close to my heart to report from this climate conference and make it transparent what is happening here, because a lot of important, momentous global processes are being talked about here that will determine our future. The European Union is part of the UNPCCC, so it's not Germany or France that is taking a position, but a common European position. The Europeans have to coordinate. So we are here from the European Parliament in order to listen and watch what the EU negotiators are doing. We agreed on a position amongst ourselves and are being briefed and then take a position. We are also meeting a lot of different other delegations, from the United States to the Maldives to the Marshall Islands, Brazil, and so on. And in order to get an impression how the negotiations are going and how the European Union is taking part in them, I think the first thing that needs to be said is we had last year in Glasgow already quite a large climate conference, and we set the standards there. It was, for instance, about wanting to achieve the 1.5 degree target, and the targets having to be made more ambitious, and also that we have to talk about loss and damage. We want to reduce coal, and so there is a feeling, you can feel a sense that can we achieve these things, or will we get stuck on the level that we had in Glasgow and have to make do with what we had then? Of course, we want to advance things further than that. The second thing that we talked about here, also with people from the Global South, and the question keeps coming up: how can we trust you as the European Union, as the US, as the Global North, as industrial countries? There have been so many promises, for instance, of $100 billion being provided since beginning in 2020, or yes, last year in Glasgow, there was a promise that to raise the climate targets and before this conference now in Sharm el-Sheikh, and a lot of that didn't actually happen. So where is the credibility of the global North and the European Union? I think we have a certain degree of credibility as Europe, as European Union, and also as Germany. For instance, it's often said that Germany is ramping up coal again and there's more CO2 emission, but I think under the current context, this can be legitimized, but only under the assumption that renewables are strongly strengthened, and those are the goals also that Germany has set itself. But this also enters into the central political conflict that is currently being playing out, which is the one about loss and damage and who pays for that. As Chiara has already said, there is the adaptation, there is the mitigation, and then there's also the loss and damage for the damage already done. And it's now about a mechanism for this, and the countries of the South are demanding that now. In the negotiations, there is now a paper from the countries of the South, which proposes to set up a process together with 34 states that want to manage this together. The proposal is that until the next climate conference, which I think will happen in Dubai, that within that year, by that time, this facility, this financing instrument for loss and damage should be set up. The European Union says, no, we can engage with a process, but we don't want to fix yet whether such a financing instrument will in the end come out of it, or whether we want to use the financing options that we already have and use those more rapidly for the damage. That is sort of the point that things are turning around currently, also in the conversations that I'm having. But there's also another dimension that enters into this concerning the interests of the European Union, namely, these negotiations are still taking place like 30 years ago. On the one side, there's the industrial countries, the global North, mainly the West, the US, EU, Canada, South Korea, Japan. And on the other side are the so-called developing countries of the global South, but that also includes China, the Gulf states. And this no longer really reflects the power relations, but also the relations of who is producing how much CO2. Even if you look at the historical CO2 emissions, then China is well on its way to equalize with the European Union. So the Europeans want that China no longer gets treated as a developing country, but rather as an emitter, as a polluter. And this block is broken up, and I hope that if there should be a result in this regard, then there has to be some movement. On the one hand, I think the European Union and the United States have to acknowledge that there must be such a financing facility for the loss and damage, but on the other hand, the principle polluters pay being applied must also mean that China takes its fair share in that regard. That could lead to something. And I think Annalena and others have already said this. It can take some time, but if we have something in that regard, then that would really be a step forward, because 10 years there's been an attempt to talk about loss and damage, and it hasn't worked for 10 years. And if we can really get a process going, then that would be a step forward. And then we could really concentrate next year on the goal of keeping to the Paris Climate Agreement and reducing or limiting the global warming to 1.5 degrees.
So I have a question to Chiara and Yero as well. I would like to know more about the feeling. What's the atmosphere like? Because I remember full well in Paris, it took a while until states understood how urgent it actually is, the situation is. So now we're 7 years later, and I think the European Union, or do you think the European Union has understood the urgency? So did things change over the past years? Maybe not in comparison to Glasgow, but in comparison to Paris? Chiara, maybe you'd like to come in?
Yeah.
Yes, I need to translate the question a second to you.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
So the question concerned the atmosphere and whether the urgency was understood. Is that your impression?
Shall I go first?
Then let Yero go first now.
Okay. Yes.
Bon, tout d'abord, c'est un peu tendu, il faut l'admettre. Il y a les visages qui sont crispés. C'est pas évident. Les gens sont sur le nerf. Moi, personnellement, depuis que j'ai eu écho de ce qui se passe déjà dans les négociations, déjà concernant les inquiétudes qu'on a rencontrées avec les pertes et dommages, ça m'a
I've been involved quite a bit now, and if I look at the negotiations and the attitudes, then in comparison to the first few steps, not that much has changed. But if we're talking about the EU, then I think we have a reduction. Michael has already summarized this. It's just key that the EU understands how essential it is for us. We really need strong results, good resolutions, of course, on this conference. And let me also say something about the necessity and the urgency. Today, it's possible for you to travel here to us, here to this conference, but for us, every minute, literally every minute, life is at stake. That's the situation here for us. That's the urgency. A lot has happened in the last 3 months. Algeria, Pakistan, these are just examples where people have lost their lives. And why? Due to climate change. Because they don't have enough means, sufficient means. What are the targets? What else can I say? We have to protect these people. And what is the EU waiting for? Should more people die? Should more people take to the sea on rubber boats? You have to react now. The EU should also look at what's happening in its surroundings, in its neighboring countries. The EU will find a lot of reasons for reacting there. Yes, we can accept things. We can accept a process, that there are rules. That's not the problem. But in the long term, we don't have time. We can't wait any longer. 2 million people are now, 2 million lives are at stake now. That's the situation for us. We don't want to go on the move, but you have to understand the context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Maybe you could now speak
Chiara,
on the
question
topic
of urgency
as well.
Yes, so not easy to speak after Yero on the question of emergency, to be honest. I don't know what else I can add, but maybe I would say, like you asked Maximilian, like compared to a few years ago. I think the urgency is there. I mean, everybody's speaking here about urgency. But unfortunately, I mean, as Yero said, it's not enough. I mean, time is moving fast and we need to be able to move faster. And maybe I can highlight a couple of challenges and that also our European leaders and policymakers are facing here, is that there is a huge lobby of fossil fuel companies. So there is not only civil society organizations or Fridays for Future people here. Actually, we are very little number compared to the fossil fuel companies lobbyists that are here. Actually, there is a report that came out last week. There are more than 600 people with badges that are linked with the interest of fossil fuel companies. So there is a lot of pressure also on policymakers by these companies. And I think this doesn't help to address the urgency. Then I think there is a second threat, that's the tendency to have too much trust on technology. I mean, I think we do need technology to a certain extent, but we can't put all the trust and all the solutions on the technology side. So I think this is I would say the main two threads that are actually, I'd say, like breaking like the speed that we see moving here.
Vielen Dank. Bevor ich Michael da rannehme, habe ich hier noch eine sehr hochgewohnte Frage für
before I get back to you, I have a question here that was received a lot of votes for Stefan Rahmstorf, and I think it fits well. It's by Mr. Fosselberger, and he would like to know what about the 1.5 degree target, and is there a threat that this will already not be enough and that we won't be able to stop global warming? This is a really good question, but I do think that we need to differentiate here. There are things that affect the situation locally and globally. So certain tipping points when it comes to generally increasing global warming, but also referring to the situation of melting ice caps and in Greenland. So the global aspects refer to tipping points with regard to permafrost, and I do not think that we'll get to a point where this will actually have a major impact. I think it's a minor risk, but I do believe there's a threat that we might pass a critical threshold with regard to a tipping point. For example, with regard to corals, I think there's also a very urgent threat when it comes to the rainforest. There might be a situation where the forest might just die, just what we're seeing currently here in Germany in the Harz area, Harz region, but this greenhouse effect. I'm not sure there will be actually a runaway greenhouse effect. I think that's very unlikely, and there's barely a climate model that points in that direction.
Du noch was zu der Einschätzung sagen, sonst würde ich dir auch gleich
Michael, maybe you'd like to come in when it comes to how you see things, but I'd also like to ask another question. Maybe if you'll allow me, I'll do that. Looking at investment of EU countries in fossil fuels in Africa, because I think there are many questions came up here, not only with regard to Senegal, but also others. Michael, I'd like to pass you the floor. Give the floor to you here, and many questions have to do with each other. So Carsten Elster would like to know when it comes to financing gas facilities, on the African continent, that will be a breach of the Glasgow Agreement. Can we do something there? Is there still something we can do, or has all of this already been agreed? Annalena Baerbock also alluded to this. Should we put money into this? Should we allow investment? Urban Weber would like to know this. Shouldn't we channel these funds into renewables? And then a question from Parents for Future from Bonn also points in that direction. Gas projects on the African continent, is that already something that's final, or can we still do something there? So first of all, to Michael and then to Yero. Very difficult questions.
Dem, was die EU hier gerade verfolgt und was wir sozusagen als Parlamentsteam verfolgen, weil das ja quasi diese Politik sozusagen der Mitglied.
What we are doing here as the member states is not, I don't know completely all of that, but where this debate is now stuck is that the International Energy Agency has told us that there cannot be new investment in fossil energy on the side of the industrial countries if we want to keep to the 1.5-degree target. And in the course of this energy crisis, we see such investments being made also by the German government and with respect to Senegal. The way this is justified, which I don't endorse, but the justification given is that this is not raising the amount of gas being extracted overall, because we're getting less gas from Russia and more from other targets, and the total amount is the same. I don't endorse that justification because the gas from Russia is still being sold only to others, to China and India and so on. So this is certainly very problematic. As far as I know, there's no contract yet for that, but I know that this is very strongly related to the question of credibility. And as the European Union and as Germany,
wie glaubwürdig ist das, wenn man sozusagen auf der einen Seite jetzt Kohle anfährt?
We are always being confronted with how credible it actually is if we're looking for coal and gas in places like in Senegal, and at the same time we say that we're the climate champions and that the other countries who don't have such a high per capita income yet are supposed to not take a fossil development path, but rather keep the fossil fuels in the ground. And that's a real problem. These questions are very legitimate. The wealth in Europe was produced on the basis of CO2 emissions. How can we keep others from doing the same? That's a legitimate question. And the only way to do that is with a partnership where we don't continue as before and don't expand in the fossil area. So I think we really have to talk about that again in Germany. I talked to others here from Germany about this, and I do feel that this is an open question, but I can't really say exactly the state of that question. And on the urgency, maybe I can also address the question of urgency. The urgency that the climate crisis is with us and we have to reduce emissions. I think there's a sense that that sense of urgency exists since the Paris Climate Agreement, and Professor Stefan Rahmstorf has already mentioned that we are making progress there. We were on a path towards 4 degrees in the past, and we're at a better point now. But what is also new is that the climate crisis really is with us right now and is already producing loss and damages right now. That's about the small island nations, but it's also, of course, about things like the drought on the Horn of Africa, the floods in Pakistan. And that's part of why the question of loss and damage is so much on the agenda, because it's already happening. And so in my view, it hasn't really been understood on the part of the European decision makers that one cannot say there's a process and it will somehow take its course, but rather there have to be financing mechanisms. It has to become concrete. And I think this urgency that we really have to deal with the climate crisis right now as it's taking place, I would wish that we really all understand that and take it seriously as we do the goal of reducing emissions. If I can interject there very briefly, this argument from the German federal government that we are not using more gas, only different gas, this reminds me a bit of my mother, who argued 30 years ago, if she flies with an airplane, she doesn't create emissions because the airplane would fly even without her being in it. But of course, it depends on the financial streams, the financial flow, whether I give the money to an airline or I give it to a new gas field in Senegal. If I put the money there, then a return on investment is expected. That creates new pressure to sell the gas. And if there is more supply, the price drops, and that increases the demand. So that argument is just short-sighted. Yero and Chiara, it's great that we're doing so well with the languages. So what do you think of these gas plans in Senegal? How do you view the public opinion in Senegal? Are there public positions on that from the government also?
Premièrement, il faut souligner que
I think one aspect has to be emphasized. For Senegal and for many African countries, the population tries to concentrate on the positive things. What can be done financially? What can we get started financially? And that's what people focus on. And it's hard to communicate to people that there is money in gas and coal, and at the same time to make clear that nevertheless it carries a huge risk. It is, of course, normal to feel that way and for it to be that way, because we are, after all, a country that is an emerging economy that is developing, and it's a pity, it's very difficult to get across to the population that if we now use these gas reserves, that will create further problems and will just exacerbate problems.
Tous les pays africains, parce qu'il y a une propagande publicitaire qui est derrière tout cela. Il y a une propagande
the same is true in a similar way for other African countries. This also manifests in the communication. There's a lot of propaganda and communication in many African countries, and there's a massive avenue of communication there. We have to be louder. We have to make clear that there's a lot of difficulties related to gas. It's a risk. We have to take a deep, hard look at reality. Europe is interested in our gas, but we also have to play a role. We have to make to see how we can achieve something. That's where the problem lies.
N'empêche que nous qui avons compris vraiment le danger que ça représente.
What other challenges are there? Well, there are a number, and I think we've understood them quite well now. We try to raise awareness to make people more sensitized to the challenges, but as I said, it's a huge challenge. Thank you very much. I think it was important to to put that in context, that it's that there are financial incentives, that the money can be tainted, as one would say in English. It can be dirty money. It's a discussion that we have to lead this discussion also during the energy crisis. On the question of European energy projects in Africa and the Global South, are there, Chiara, Stefan, Michael, do you want to add to that subject, or else I would continue? Because then I would continue and take up some oral questions. First, we have Anna Mertens raising her hand. She's from Transparency International. I would love to call on her because we have a number of questions on lobbying. And so I'm happy to hear from Anna Mertens, who's joining us and asking her oral question, if Zoom allows me to do that. Anna Mertens, you should now be able to unmute yourself. And then it could work out. Let's wait a second. Now. Anna Mertens. Now it should be working. No, unfortunately not. Then I'll call on Jörg Rickens. Let's see if that works out. Jörg Rickens, please unmute your microphone. Yes, here I am. Greetings. Great. Please ask your question. Yes, I wrote it in the chat. This question whether such a worldwide system of greenhouse gas certificates, emission certificates, could be established. As far as I know, there is such a thing being thought of at the EU level, but now that there's such a positive dynamic in Egypt, maybe it could be, one could venture to try to do it globally, to steer things through such certificates. So what chances do you see for that? Thank you, and I'll hand that question directly to the panel. Who wants to address that question? Who wants to go first? Micha, sure. Right. We already have this system in the European Union. That's the emissions trading system that I'm actually involved in negotiating. That has existed for quite some time, and the first 15 years didn't work at all because there were far too many emission certificates, and there was no real CO2 price. Only now have we reached a situation where the price is fluctuating around 70 euros and it's starting to make sense. Globally, from an economic perspective, if you ask an economy professor, then they always say it's the best to do it through a market. But I think politically, the prerequisites for that are not there. First, one would have to set up in a way that can be implemented everywhere with the same rules. I don't think we're at that point currently. And the second issue, for instance, the United States at the federal level don't even have the option of introducing such a system. They could only do that in the individual states. So even the structure of states can be an obstacle to this. Third issue is that one price for the entire world is unfair. If we have a worldwide global system, we have one price, which is then 50 euros. That's far too low for the EU in order to save CO2 emissions. For a country like South Africa or, say, Bangladesh, it's far too high. So almost no one could afford to drive a car there, then, for instance. So there are some big questions there. There's this idea that one could have a climate club, found a climate club, where climate policy and energy policy could be coordinated, where one sees whether things can be implemented together. I think that's a good idea. I think it's right that we are in this so-called mitigation work program where we really make more concrete what countries have to do. This is, by the way, something that Annalena is negotiating for Germany. It's not just enough to have climate targets, also renewable targets, and so on. Dealing with all this through a global certificate trading scheme is maybe sounds good on paper, but it's not going to work out. Thank you very much. I feel that was actually quite a comprehensive answer to that question, and I don't see any hands raised from the other speakers, so I will try again whether Anna Mountain's microphone is working now. Testing? No, unfortunately not. Then I would now draw up another question from another woman, Karin Fritsche. Karin Fritsche, the floor is yours. Let's see whether it works. Let's keep the mic turned on, and then I will give another question into the round because we have 4 or 5 minutes left. A lot of questions that are being posed, I want to make that transparent, are on the subject of what Germany is currently doing, and as we all know, in the transport sector and in the coal phase out, some things are moving, some things aren't moving, a lot of things aren't moving. Let me take it away slightly from Germany and try to generalize the issue. Or maybe to Chiara. Do you feel that we are now ultimately in a renaissance of fossils? More roads are being built, more fossil fuels are being consumed. The climate movement is talking, like Luisa Noba has talked about, a global renaissance of fossil energy. You as a civil society, do you feel there is an acute danger that we're going the path back that we've already taken? What's your assessment of that? Also with a view to Germany, but that's a larger picture that's not only related to Germany.
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think it's there is the risk. Risk is there. I think, unfortunately, also as a consequence of the Russian war against Ukraine, we saw some countries in Europe to go back to coal. And we saw countries like keeping investing in fossil fuels. So I think at the same time, we also saw a support from, especially from some European legislations in terms of accelerating the transition towards renewables. So I think we are at a tipping point, and we need to make sure that we don't fall in that trap of, and again, like it's all about money. It's really about making the right investments in this moment that we're actually with the potential that this moment in time we are can really shift the economy and the economic system we are in. So that's why, I mean, going back to the gas question in Africa, like, I mean, we do all know that we do need some gas to go over this winter, and there's some communities in certain countries within Europe and outside Europe do need this transition. But we are absolutely calling for no way of new infrastructures. And I think this is really important to highlight, because also we need to make sure that this climate movement, we don't sound naive, but I think that we need to have the vision, the longer term vision. We need to move away from fossil fuels at all levels as soon as possible, and with the targets that actually we are calling for 25 for gas and et cetera, et cetera.
Dankeschön.
Thank you. We have 1 or 2 minutes left. I would like to try a final round that could be interesting, namely to the four of you. What is the one sentence that should be written in the final document so that you could say that you would say the climate conference in Egypt was a success? Is there one sentence, one measure that you would say because of that it's been a success? And if not, then why not?
I can go first if
Yes,
you want.
good. Yeah.
I think, as I said at the beginning, I would like to see a stronger human rights language in the cover decision of this COP, because I mean, my dream is to see one day a COP that is stating there is no climate justice without human rights.
Stefan Rahmstorf.
Stefan Rahmstorf. To maybe put up an unrealistic demand that will certainly not be part of the final document, one should agree on removing all subsidies for fossil fuel usage as quickly as possible. Yero, Sarr?
La phrase que j'aimerais bien voir, c'est mettre l'humain.
Well, what do I think it should be written there? The person, the human being, has to be at the center, has to be put into the center. We'll get Yero back with us, and until he comes back, Michael, let's continue with you. By the way, Stefan Rahmstorf, it at least says that all inefficient subsidies have to be stopped. I'm not sure what efficient subsidies for fossil fuels would be, but I think it must say, the document must say, we need climate justice, and therefore loss and damage from the climate crisis, triggered by the climate crisis, must be financed through a facility that follows the principle polluters pay. Right, I'll try Yero again. Yero, Sarr?
La phrase que j'aimerais bien voir, c'est de mettre l'homme, l'humain.
So, which sentence would I like to see? I wanted to say the human is at the center. And I don't want there to be wars. A world without war, without crisis, without hunger. A world in which no one is hungry. A world in which everyone has a beautiful place. Wonderful. Thank you. That was a good final round. That brought up some hope and showed where the open problems are. Michael, do you want to say a few words to conclude as the co-host, or shall we leave it at that for today? I just want to say thank you to everyone who watched, to our panelists. Special thanks also to Annalena Baerbock for joining this webinar and making issues transparent, creating transparency and facing questions. I think that's special. And other than that, I also want to point to the contribution from Professor Rahmstorf. There's hope, and it's worth a fight. And this is something, as you said, that is not often heard in a climate webinar, but it is the case, and that's why we keep going. It just remains to me to say thank you to the interpreters who did a great job again today, and thank you to all the guests and all the 1,000 people who are here with us. Thank you very much. We'll continue with Europe calling right after the end of the conference. Next Tuesday, we will be having an analysis webinar. Next Tuesday, 2015. We'll send you a link, and until then, have a good evening and stay true to Europe calling. Goodbye. Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you.